Quieting down. I am going to pick up from where Don pretty much left off. I have kind of been given the task by Don to cover the engine program and our time here at Iowa in graduate school together. And so I would like to say that this is the second year in a row that I have come with my wife to Iowa City to celebrate an accomplishment of Don involving 50 years. And last year at this time, as you saw on the screen, October 10th, was the 50th wedding anniversary for Don and Marie. Quite an accomplishment these days, and congratulations. And now we'll turn to Don's 50 years of teaching and research. But before I do that, I would like to just give you a little bit of a background on how I actually ended up here at Iowa and met my lovely wife. And we are approaching 50 years of being, or that anniversary. For me, it actually started also with the picture that Don showed, the launch of Sputnik. And for those that weren't alive at the time, the impact that had on the national psychic is hard to understate. It really it was such a kind of a setback to our impression of ourselves that it actually led, at least in my case, to a decision to be part of the space program. I was in my freshman year at Virginia Tech when Sputnik went up. It only operated for less than, or for a few weeks, but it was certainly a big impact. And I decided I wanted to be part of the space program and had no idea how to do that, where or how. And shortly thereafter, as Don described very, very well, the launch of Explorer 1 occurred, and these three gentlemen, which he pointed out, two of those actually have had impact on my life. Wernher von Braun was the guy who was in charge of the Redstone arsenal and the rocket that launched Explorer 1. And in the summer of '59, I heard a talk by him about the successful launch of Explorer 1. And he also then described a couple of launches that had occurred a little later of the Pioneer space program. Then these were designed to actually leave the Earth's gravitational well and become interplanetary probes. Well, that didn't work, and the particular probe, as it went outbound, failed to achieve enough velocity to the 11 kilometers per second or so that it needed, and it fell back to Earth. And von Braun described the great joy a professor by the name of Van Allen from the University of Iowa had over this extra set of passes through the radiate, or what became known as the major discovery of the space age, these belts of intense radiation that bear his name. So I decided to come to Iowa, and you've seen this picture many times here. I don't exactly remember the very first time I met Don, but I am convinced that it had to do with Engine 3. My first year was actually spent as a TA serving in a course being taught by O'Brien, an introductory physics course. And these then are the three gentlemen, the project scientist, the project manager, and the project engineer. Don was, as he described his transition from undergraduate to graduate during the process of Engine 3's construction. Engine 3 was launched in December of '62. I called out 18 particle detectors. Don called out 22 instruments. I think that number, those two numbers go together because in addition to the particle detectors, there were 3 photometers and a very low frequency electromagnetic wave detector, which we've heard about. It had 2 independent telemetry systems, which Don had designed. And the deal was that on the roof of the physics building, there was an antenna system, a couple of Yagis that you could control, and you would pick up the satellite as it came up over the horizon, send a coded command, and it would play for 17.3 minutes as it transitioned across the sky. This program, as Don mentioned, was a great success, and we'll describe a couple of the successes that it actually had. If you took the top off of the sphere and looked down on it, here are those 18 particle detectors and the 3 photometers. The magnetic axis that you see here, O'Brien, after the Engine 1 experience, was going to orient the entire space launch vehicle if he had to. So it was an overkill magnet, but it was designed then to align itself with the local magnetic field, which was down in the northern hemisphere. So these photometers would look down on the aurora in the northern hemisphere. This would look down on the aurora in the southern hemisphere. And so during my second year as a graduate student here, I started to work on Engine 3, assisting Kurt Laughlin with the calibration of the differential magnetic spectrometer and an integral magnetic spectrometer. Shortly after launch, sometime in early 1963, O'Brien and Laughlin left to establish a program at Rice, similar to the engine program here. And I think O'Brien even asked Don to go along with him to Rice. Luckily, Don made the right decision. At that point, Dr. Van Allen called me into his office and told me, or asked me, to take over running Engine 3 and to manage the ground station as well as scheduling the passes for NASA to record through their state and network. And this is now as a second year graduate student. I mean, it doesn't meet the criteria where Don was doing all this work as an undergraduate, but still a lot of responsibility for a second year graduate student. So this was my office, or desk, I guess. I put this in for a couple different reasons to show you the sign of the time. Here is the differential magnetic spectrometer, and here was our recording means, these strip charts that you would then scale off the data. And you notice the calculator on my desk here was this slide rule underneath the paper. And that was the sign of the times. This was how we recorded data, how we calculated counting rates and recorded them. My parents asked me what I was doing, and so I made a couple slides here of what I was doing so that I could let them know. I'm not sure how much they understood of the slides, but here is the differential magnetic spectrometer, and as you can see, it had a very permanent magnet, and the electrons would fall through the magnet and enter a region in here, which had 3 Anton 213 thin-winded Geiger tubes, one being pointing in such a way that it would sample a certain passband between like 90 and 100 kilovolts, and one looking the other direction, having an entrance essentially over here, would measure 40 kilovolt electrons. And then there was a background there known as SPB, which again picked up the starfish radiation belt and monitored that decay for some years. And then this is how the spectrometer sat in the actual spacecraft. INGEN did actually, can claim very well the first successful use of magnetic alignment. You can see the spacecraft axis here and how the satellite orients itself much like a three-dimensional compass needle. Now, again, the orientation was not immediately achieved because shortly after launch, well, if you take the satellite, its moment of inertia, and the magnetic moment of the bar magnet, this can be thought of as a simple or harmonic oscillator that will have a certain amplitude. And so you can calculate that. That should be fixed. O'Brien actually calculated that, and he felt that in terms of the units of Gauss seconds squared, the oscillation period would, or that ratio would be this particular value. It turned out that what was actually measured was a long way away from that, indicating that again, as in engine 1, engine 3 was hanging on the vehicle, the launch platform. But for some reason that was never determined, between revolution 57 and 60, the satellite became free, and as soon as it became free, it was magnetically controlled, but the oscillation was very large, as you can see in this slide, where the deviation from alignment, it was oscillating as high as 130, 140 degrees, swinging back and forth. And within a 2-week period, the hysteresis rods that damped the oscillation out brought the satellite down to the order of 5 degrees alignment. So a first for engine 3, a first of many firsts. My first paper actually was with Don. It was a paper in which we looked at one of the sensors, one of the 18 particle detectors that had open-ended, it was just an electron multiplier. And so in the course of launch, it had actually become somewhat uncalibrated. And so we'd spent some time together discussing how to calibrate it using the well-calibrated electron passbands, and came up with this particular passband here. And once that was done, we found that the radiation belts, there's a kind of what is known as a trapping boundary. We could take the calibration at this point and determine what the efficiency of the electron multiplier was, and found that there were these regions of intense flux just beyond the trapping boundary. And as a result of that, we can claim that Engine 3 was the first satellite to actually make the measurement of greater than 10 kilovolt electrons simultaneously with the aurora light output. And this correlates quite well. Also was one of Don's frequency channels on auroral hits. So another first for Engine 3 and that program. Here is an article from the Daily Iowan. I hope you all can read that. If I look at the introduction up here at the top, Don and I decided to try to push for recognition of Engine 3. So it looks like I've lost it. At its first year anniversary. And so we had arranged for this to be published on December 13th of 1963. And the satellite, almost precisely the day we did this interview, was decided to quit accepting the Mode A command to turn on. So we had one very full 1 year of data. And in that 1 year of data, we transmitted, or 180 million bits of scientific data were transmitted to the ground. And at the time, that was a record for a scientific Earth satellite. So now reading on down in this article, the Don made the statement and was quoted that Engine 3 directly observed the effect of the electrons raining down into the atmosphere and uniquely established the immediate cause of the aurora. I noted that the origin of these particles was not definitively established, and that probably is still a little bit of a controversy as well. So, but the next point is kind of something that led to a lot of very interesting stories, and that is, in addition to the instruments, this VLF antenna that sits on top of Engine 3 did measure all of these various sounds, whistles, howls, chirps, squeaks, and of completely unknown origin. And that led to some interesting things as time evolved. The tracking station, as I mentioned, was over in the old physics building on the Pentacrest, and the Yagi antennas were mounted up on the roof, and so they could be controlled in azimuth and in elevation. And I have a picture of a more recent version of that. And also, I think Anthea Craven is in the audience, and if you have a chance to talk to her, She helped her father in southern Rhodesia actually track Engine 3 with a hand-operated set of such antennas. As being in charge of the ground station, I would consult the station log each morning, and was marveled at some of the descriptions of what they were hearing. This attempt by, or this accomplishment by Don of taking the telemetry signal and modulating it with the VLF so that what you were listening in the audio is what he was just playing. The operator heard that. And these students could come up with some interesting explanations of that. Here you see what I was talking about here, where you have a tripod that is able to swing an antenna in azimuth and elevation. And this is one in Boston where you see the John Hancock building and the Prudential Tower in the background there from some students that I got involved with a small satellite program as well. So Don played this audio, and I listened to this many times over the course of the engine program. But these spherics, which would come down and then resonate, you know, chung doing, chung doing. One morning I opened the logbook up, and this guy had written, "Gunfight at OK Corral." Ricocheting bullets. So, like I say, imagination ran rampant. In another, for Dawn Chorus, I can remember one guy saying, a large choir whistling down a tunnel, as a description of what he was hearing and what this particular resonance or sound was sounding like to him. So again, this was a first in the study of one of these VLF wave modes. Engine 5 came along, and this opened up now a new era, because not only did it have the magnetic sensor, it had an electric field sensor as well. And you can see the fact that these two spheres would be able to measure the magnetic or the electric component of any kind of wave field, and the magnetic loop would then measure the magnetic field, and that allowed then, measuring simultaneously both of these components, the ability to look at pointing flux. And here you see the first pointing flux of, pointing flux is the direction in which the energy is being propagated by the wave. And you can see now how lightning is upgoing from the ground, and then the return is coming now from the opposite hemisphere, reflected and coming back. And then here you even see a situation where the stuff coming down is kind of reflected and starts another path to the other hemisphere. Really a very significant, again, first. Now Don took that and with Steve Moser, who's in the crowd here, determined that one of the types of auroral intensities, the auroral hiss, could be characterized as downgoing, giving this kind of saucer-like feature, but occasionally you would see stuff that was upgoing as well. And that interpretation was that here you have a trapping boundary in which you have closed field lines and aurora or precipitating auroral electrons on open field lines, creating these types of conditions where you have this kind of saucer-like affair and in the spectrogram. So a major step forward. This picture is kind of what we understand the magnetosphere to be at this point. The solar wind is blowing out from the sun. It's convecting the interplanetary magnetic field. And as long as that magnetic field has a southward component when it impinges on the magnetopause, you have reconnection occurring there, and the field lines sweep back to the night side. And you do have to have some type of mechanism to return them to the front side. Otherwise, you will have a flux catastrophe as the flux builds up in the tail. So the pattern that actually evolves then is that you get this thing happening, and when you project these field lines down to the top of the, well, down to the atmosphere, down to the top of the ionosphere, you see a track in which you have this anti-sunward motion and then a return flow at lower latitudes. That particular flow is usually called a two-cell convection pattern, in which you have the anti-sunward flow across the polar cap, and as the satellite moves into from low latitudes into the polar cap, it sees the sunward flow, and then at on the opposite flank, it will also see sunward flow. And this has now been measured many times, where you have the sunward flow, the anti-sunward flow, and reversing to the sunward flow. It turns out that Dave Kaufman and Don made the very first measurement of this anti-sunward flow over the polar cap. Again, a very significant first for Don. There were a number of firsts associated with auroral studies with Engine 5. A significant one being the explanation for kind of the inverted V structure associated with auroral phenomenon. Here you can see kind of the classical radiation belt precipitation and a region of fairly intense inverted V's, but in association with that, you could see a kind of a bipolar signature in the electric field, and that was interpreted to be due to the fact that as the satellite flies through, you see the field going in one direction, kind of strictly field aligned in this direction, and then reversing as you go through the field on the opposite side of such a structure. So this bipolar type signature that you see here is a straightforward interpretation of how your parallel electric fields are or exist and give rise to the inverted V structure. So again, I think I can recall actually a meeting in Washington, D.C. when Don first reported on that particular measurement. So Don has been involved in many firsts, and I offer my congratulations to him on his 50 years of teaching and research. And there have been many along the way. His time, or our time together down in the Miller Building before the NASA building behind us was built. We had adjoining offices and had a lot of great discussions there, and I think the engine program has provided a trove of treasures, of which Don has been there as making many firsts. So I congratulate him and thank you very much. Hopefully I made up for a few minutes.
Was engine 3 the first detector that had this 40 KeV channel? Because there's this terminology for the 40 KeV traffic pattern that persisted for many, many years before. I was curious which was the first satellite that established that.
I think it was the fact that the Anton 213 tube had a mica window, and it was kind of that thing that caused the cutoff to be more or less at 40 kilovolts. McDermott and Burroughs with their Alouette instruments had the same Geiger tube, and so it was just, you know, the Geiger tube that was available, and so the threshold is what it's going to be going through that window, and so that has persisted. I would agree.
Yeah, it persisted in the mid-70s. Everybody talked about the 40 KeV traffic pattern, and it kind of goes away super forward.
Yeah. I mean, it was very difficult to get below 40 kilovolts in measuring electrons for a long time. So.
Yeah, I was curious to when tracking moved to North Liberty, the satellite tracking.
The way I understand that sequence is that Engine 3 used the ground station in the basement of the old physics building, and Engine 4 came along, and one of the ideas was to put a tracking station actually down to the south, and they had a great deal of trouble transmitting data from that station to the top of the building behind us here. I remember people up on the roof there with telescopes looking toward that station, and people climbing up in trees and putting big sheets in the tree to see whether, and they ended up buying trees from a couple farmers to, you know, have them cut down so that the path was correct. And it was at that time, Van Allen asked me about my experience with Anthea's father being able to produce good data from his personal tracking station there in southern Rhodesia, and I remember saying that, you know, he was the best operator that we had on Engine 3, and so Van Allen invited John Rogers to come over, and then John was in charge of the tracking station, and somewhere in all of that they decided to move it out to North Liberty, and I was well on my way to Canada at that time to take a postdoc. So.
I comment on that because I was part of that.
Okay.
We cut down a tree that shaded a farmer's hog lot. So we bought him a hog shed. We actually built him a building to shade his hog. For that tree, we did not get him under the horizon. That is an absolute true story.
Graduate school was fun.
I was curious if the old observatory down toward Riverside, is that the location of the southern points that you were describing?
I think that's right.
It was at the observatory.
In Hills.
When they built the high voltage transmission line.
It had to move.
there, they decided to relocate to where they were getting rid of the noise.
Any other comments or questions? None.
Ted, I think I learned a number of things from your talk. One of them was that engine 3 was actually hung up on a launch vehicle. I had never realized that.
Yeah.
And then separated at some point.
It took about a week for it to fall off, 57. So,
I might make another comment about that. When engine 3 was launched, it was launched out of the Pacific Missile Range going south. Anyway, they couldn't find a spaceman. You know, they were sending commands. I think about 3 days later, there was a station out of Hawaii sent commands, you know, to turn our instrument on. They heard the spacecraft. And then gradually they began to figure out the orbit. And after analysis afterwards, I happened to know a little bit about the rocketry. They had an integrating accelerometer on the rocket. So you measure the vertical acceleration, and then you integrate that to get velocity. And you want to turn the engine off, the final stage off, when the velocity is the circular orbit velocity. Well, the integrating accelerometer failed. And it just kept running until it ran out of gas. And it gave us kind of a somewhat elliptical orbit.
right.
I never realized till to this day that it had hung up on the rocket somehow for several days.
But almost a week.
And then somehow it came loose.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. The design orbit that O'Brien wanted was almost 1,000. I think it's 950 kilometers circular, and it turned out to be a 200 by 2,700 kilometer apogee perigee. So, excuse me. It was a little bit off, but you know, that altitude range actually had some advantages as well. And, you know, I mean, we had one solid year of data that got many PhD theses. I think Tom Armstrong here got his PhD off of that, as well as Don and myself.
By the way, the fact that they couldn't find the spacecraft for something like 3 or 4 days never gave me very much confidence that North America cared.
Thank you.